Hello, in today's video, we're going to be replacing the rear brake pads on this 2016 Honda CRV. After loosening all 5 lug nuts, we'll lift the vehicle by this lifting point just in front of the rear wheel. Once it's high enough to remove the wheel, we position our jack stand under it as well. Now that we got it lifted and supported, we can remove the lug nuts and the wheel completely using a 19mm socket. Now to remove the brake caliper, it'll have 2 bolts attaching it, and for these we will use a 12mm socket to loosen them counterclockwise. Now that they're loose, we should be able to remove them by hand. But before going any further, I must mention that this video is meant for vehicles without the electronic parking brake. Those with electronic parking brake must be put into maintenance mode before servicing. And with those bolts off, the caliper is able to slide out, but it won't have enough slack to where we remove this bolt on the brake hose guide using a 12mm socket as well. And with that bolt off, the caliper has enough slack to be removed. The inner brake pad will come off with it, being that it has 3 prongs holding it inside the piston. And while we have it here, we may as well compress the caliper piston to accommodate the new brake pads. But my regular caliper compressing tool will not fit in this case. So I'm going to end up having to use a kit that I use on most rear brake calipers as well. But first let's remove this old brake pad since I won't be needing it. So I set up the tool like so with the regular piston adapter so it'll push it in directly instead of how I normally use it to rotate the rear pistons with the integrated parking brake. And with this one, we have plenty of room. So let's now rotate this outer nut, removing any slack between the tool and the caliper. Now once we got it nice and tight, let's rotate the handle and compress the piston. Whenever you're compressing a caliper piston, you do want to make sure you'll have enough room in the brake fluid reservoir to accommodate for the fluid that's returning. Even though the rear calipers are small and the fluid won't be much, you still want to make sure. Now to remove the anti-rattle spring, since we got a replacement, using something like a screwdriver, we'll pry one edge back to get this edge past the caliper, allowing us to slide out the spring. And here we got both our old one and our new one, comparing them to make sure that they match before installing it. Once we verify it's good to use, let's go ahead and install it. Sliding one edge onto the caliper first, then we can use the screwdriver to gently pry it back to get the other edge to slide in. And now we'll just center it on the caliper. To remove this remaining brake pad, just slide it back and off. Now to remove these brake pad retainers, since we got replacements for these as well, included in our brake pad kit. To remove them, all we do is slide them up and off. Once again comparing them to make sure that the new ones match the original, which they do. To remove this other one up here, pull this one down and out. Before installing the new ones, let's spray the bracket where the retainers sit to get any dirt or debris off. Spraying them lightly with brake cleaner on all 4 spots, then wipe them down with a clean towel. Now that that's clean, let's install the new retainer, pushing it down into position. Same with this upper one as well. Now to prepare the brake pads, we'll want to lubricate the contact areas to eliminate any possible vibration that can cause brake squeal. So on this outer pad, we lubricate where the caliper fingers will grab against the brake pad, and also the edges that slide across the brake pad retainers. And now that it's lubricated, we'll slide this brake pad into place. Now for our inner brake pad, it'll have this brake warning tab that you'll want to be supported by the brake pad backing if it were to rub in the forward direction. So for this side, we're going to mount it pointing down. Once again lubricating the contact points, and lubricating where the piston will sit. Once it's lubricated, let's go ahead and install it on our caliper, sliding the 3 prongs into the caliper piston, and if you find them to be too far apart, you can kind of bend them inward, but you don't want to overdo it. Once we get the 3 prongs going into the piston, we'll need to center it across the anti-rattle spring, or it'll sit angled like so. Although this step can be kind of annoying, you want to make sure that it goes on properly. Now that we got that ready, let's lubricate our caliper guide pins. We'll pull them off one by one, cleaning off any of the old lubricant, and now using the brake caliper lubricant, we'll wipe on some of the new one till it's properly lubricated all around. But you don't want to overdo it. Once it's lubricated, let's reinstall the guide pin, making sure that the rubber boot goes in all around, and that the guide pin moves freely, like so. If you prefer, you can also leave the rubber boot attached to the bracket and just slide out the pin. But if you do it this way, you want to make sure to avoid the boot wiping off the new lubricant on install. But as you can see, this way is much easier to reinstall the pin. Now all that's left is to reinstall the brake caliper, sliding in the brake pad into the bracket, pushing in the guide pins if needed to get the caliper completely in. Reinstall the 2 caliper bolts, threading them in as much as you can by hand. And if you notice it rotating the pin as you thread in the bolt, you can either hold them with your finger as you thread them back on as I'm doing here, or use a 17mm wrench to hold the guide pin as you tighten the bolts. Now that they're tightened down, we can torque them down to 17 foot-pounds of torque. Reinstall and tighten this guide bolt. Once we complete both sides, we'll want to pump the brake pedal a few times so that the piston butts up against the new brake pads and removes any space between them. Then all we have left is to reinstall the wheel and torque them down to 80 foot-pounds in the star pattern, completing our video. Well, I hope you were able to find this video helpful or informative. If so, please click that thumbs up button to support my video and my channel, and please subscribe if you haven't done so.